our first Compost Tea Talk topic is troubleshooting. So all the things that, you know, once you've started started food scrap composting, what has come up? What may not quite make as much sense as you thought it would once, now that you're actually going and have some experience behind you. I do want to just acknowledge that we did ask for questions in advance for when folks registered, and some of you did fill those in, and some of them were more about compost use than troubleshooting. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that we did receive those questions, and we'll be circling to topics like compost use and other topics in future Tea Talk sessions. But today we're really going to try to stay focused on troubleshooting to make the most of the hour that we have together. The other thing I wanted to just give you guys a clue about, because it's something that you'll be hearing come out as we go through this short slide deck, which we're going to go through in full and then open it up for Q&A. But you may note that regardless of sort of the issue that we're talking about, a lot of the solutions will sound very similar from one to the other. And that's because there is a lot of overlap. And once you sort of get these, you know, basic best management practices down, that will address all kinds of issues that you might be seeing right now. So go ahead to the next slide. All right, and so I'm actually going to pass the this topic about temperatures and compost not heating up to my co-trainer, Kat.
All right, thanks, Natasha. And your voice has very much improved since you turned video.
Oh, good.
So that's great. I hope that's working out for everybody. Let us know in the chat if you're having any trouble hearing. So yes, as Natasha mentioned, a lot of these issues are, or all of the issues in composting are related. It's a living organism. Our compost pile is a living organism itself, made up of billions and billions of other living organisms that we need to be there in order to do the work. The heat from a compost pile comes from within. It's these organisms that are so happy with their buffet, with the perfect recipe, that they're reproducing like mad. And as they do that, they create heat. As they do that, they also use up oxygen because they're living organisms. And as the oxygen gets used up, our temperature changes and their activity changes. So the compost thermometer is your best friend when trying to understand the cycle of your particular compost pile. And every pile is its own biological living organism that needs to be treated as such. So creating that perfect buffet involves making sure they have the right food, the right balance of food, and we're going to go through in detail some of those things. Also making sure they have the right amount of air, just like you and I, and the right amount of moisture, just like you and I, and then also volume. If there's not enough volume, there's not enough mass to actually get the whole process going. So we're going to get into some of those details. These are the critters. So these are the party goers that you want to invite to your buffet. And the way that we do that is not by individual invitations per organism, because we actually don't even know who all of these organisms are yet. The food web is still that new. We know their classes, but we don't know their individual types. There could be 75,000 species of bacteria in a single teaspoon of healthy soil or compost. So it's about really getting the right recipe to make sure that all of the organisms are getting what they need. And also understanding that those materials that you're bringing in are also bringing in those organisms. So they come in on food scraps, they come in leaves and on hay and in woody materials. So getting the right diversity of those materials and those in your recipe is super important to make sure that all of these organisms are getting what they need and to feel welcome and included in the party. So monitoring using that temperature, that thermometer, is going to let you know how happy are the microbes. Are they getting everything they need? And then when it gets too hot, that's also letting us know something. So we basically want to be, we're going to the hot compost temps on the slide. We want to be between 100 and 160 is getting pretty hot. When it gets up to 160 degrees, we risk getting anaerobic. And what that means is the oxygen is leaving the pile and different organisms are coming into play. Soon the pile will cool and it will get really stinky because we've squished all the air out with the mass. The microbes have used up the air, and what they need now is more air added. And we're going to go into different ways of aerating a pile. Cold compost temps are between 50 and 100 degrees. A lot of backyard compost gets about this. You might even find that sort of temperature heating up in a natural pile of decomposing matter in the woods. But in order to get the aerobic organisms, which are those microbes that actually like to operate with a lot of air and not just a little air, those are called thermophilic organisms. I think I'm saying that right, thermophilic organisms. And they range between the temperatures of 100 and 160. When it gets too hot, we need to add air. We also need to make sure that they have enough moisture. So again, the buffet, all of the materials that you're bringing in are regulating in some way the air and the moisture. Sometimes we actually have to add water to our piles if our materials aren't moist enough. If you're not gaining temperatures, you might not have enough moisture in the pile, or some other part of your recipe is off. In the ways to monitor moisture, you can get a fancy little, I can't remember what it's called, but it measures moisture with a little needle, just like a thermometer does. But you can also just do a squeeze test. And we have, for all of our farmers, we have that information in your folders. And we're happy to share how to do a squeeze test with anybody. Maybe we can bring that up in the Q&A. But just like that hand is showing you, it's literally you stick your hand into the pile. You can wear a glove if you're freaked out, but and you squeeze as hard as you can. And what you should get are beads of moisture between your fingers. If it's dripping wet, it's too wet. Everybody's drowning in there, and your pile's not going to heat up because there's too much moisture in there. If you get beads of moisture, it's basically perfect. And if you don't get any moisture at all, everybody's thirsty and they're not going to heat up because they're too thirsty. So that's part one of the squeeze test. And then you open up your hand, and what happens to that clump of compost inside matters. Does it stay in a big, wet, tight clump? Does it loosely crumble apart, or does it completely crumble apart? And you're looking for that middle of the road, sort of a loose crumble, showing there's enough air and moisture in there. And I think now I am going to shift it off to Athena.
And I'm going to
Hey, everybody.
Very quickly, sorry, Athena, jump in and say I actually put the wrong, well, it's a link to a video, but the second link to the video that I just put in chat is for the squeeze test for you guys to check out later. And we'll link to that afterwards as well. Sorry, Athena, go ahead.
Okay, so my compost stinks. There are lots of reasons that your compost may stink, starting with food scraps. So the very first thing that you need to remember about food scraps is when you're collecting them, to stop any odors when you collect them in your collection cart, you really want to keep those covered with a little bit of wood shavings or a light layer of sawdust. And then the next step is when you're getting ready to put your food scraps into your pile, you'll want to make sure that you cover those right away with your carbon sources, whether you want to use wood shavings or straw or leaves or whatever your carbon sources are, you want to immediately cover those. And then with anything else, a lot of it is your odors are going to be contingent on your compost process. So if your compost process is out of whack, you're going to have varying odor issues. So excess moisture is one of them. Water is very heavy. It's going to get rid of a lot of the air, as Kat said. And also it's going to kill off your moisture, your organisms if you have too much water in there. Water saturation is not a good thing. So you'll need to add some carbon materials and probably turn your pile. If there's not enough air, you have inadequate porosity, and that's also going to make your compost smell. So if you have a rotten egg smell, and all of these are in the composting troubleshooting matrix, so we've got for you, and I think we're going to put that in the chat, and also it's going to be on the website. But you can go through the matrix and it'll tell you exactly some of the reasons for compost smells. So a rotten egg smell, for example, means that there's probably anaerobic activity. Either your whole pile has gone anaerobic or there's pockets of anaerobic conditions. And that just means that you're going to need to turn your pile, fix it because it's probably too wet, maybe add some more carbon materials or more dry amendments, or turn it because it means that there's oxygen lacking. Anaerobic means not enough oxygen. It's creating anaerobic condition. Or improve your airflow if you're doing an ASP system or if you need to turn your pile. So if you have odors generated after you turn your pile or while you're turning your pile or moving your windrow, for example, you still have anaerobic conditions, and either the pile inside is anaerobic because it's maybe too much, not enough porosity inside, or there are again pockets. So it depends on where your odors are coming from and when it's coming from. So if you have odors like you have piles of water or puddling because we had a lot of rain, that could be that the puddles itself are emanating the odors, and it's called leachate, and that's a really smelly condition. So it may not be your pile, it may be those. Excessive pile size can mean that it's too much mass and there's not enough airflow. So your odors have something to do with your overall process, whether your temperatures aren't rising enough, that's an indication that there's something wrong. If you have anaerobic conditions, so that's probably why your compost is smelling. It's not a normal process. So depending on what kind of pile is, the smell is, and that's going to be indicative of what you need to do to fix that. Carbon is usually the crux of the matter. So if you don't have, and if you have too much moisture, carbon will be a crucial thing to add and then to turn, whether your particle sizes are not right and it's creating not enough porosity within your pile because your particle sizes are too small and they've beaten down. So that can cause odor. One of the best things to remember is the diversity of carbon sources is a really good way to manage your pile better and to eliminate or reduce those piles, reduce those odors. And I think that's about it on the odors. Can you do another? Yeah, so Natasha's on with the recipe.
Great, yeah, thank you guys. And so when we talk about putting compost, composting and building piles or filling bins or tumblers, it's really just like baking a cake, right? So we're actually talking about how much carbon or carbon-rich materials to how much nitrogen-rich materials and how much water or moisture is either coming with those feedstocks or need to be added. Maybe additional water needs to be added depending on what kind of materials you're using in your recipe. But you can really think about it like a recipe. And thanks, Kat. So yeah, so this slide basically shows that, and this is something that we've talked to, that Kat, Athena, and I include in all of our trainings, and we've talked to our partner farmers about, is that everything has some carbon and some nitrogen in it, right? It's a spectrum. And so when you're talking about food scraps, it's still like 15 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. And that's it's the carbon, it's all normalized to 1 part nitrogen. But that's still on the lower end of the spectrum. And when you get up to something like sawdust or wood chips or wood shavings, depending on the kind of wood, that might be as much as 200 parts carbon to nitrogen. And so having a sense, you don't need to necessarily, especially when you're starting, do really complicated math and figure out, but what you're going for is, 20 to 40 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen in your overall recipe, in your whole pile. And so if you're using wood shavings, you're actually going to want a little bit less volume of that in proportion to your food scraps, because it might be bringing a whole lot of carbon. But if you compare that to something like leaves, which I know a lot of you are likely using for your carbon, that's in the 40 to 80 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen range. And so you're going to need more volume of that to hit that target, that target proportion or ratio between these two. And so this is just something to keep in mind, and it can get a little complicated when you're also using manures and bedding and a whole bunch of different feedstocks or components to your recipe. But it's definitely something to just keep in mind and tweak a little bit. And if you think you're sort of, you know, about the volume of each of your different materials that you're using, and then you can sort of figure out a proportion, if it's like by how many bucket loaders or 5-gallon buckets, it doesn't really matter the scale or what your unit is. This is a place where you can start thinking about tweaking if you're not getting those hot temperatures, if things are stinking, if it's really wet. And one thing that I do want to just remind folks of is that while some manures and definitely food scraps tend to be on the wetter side, it is really helpful to sort of maintain the dryness in your carbon. Because if you have soaking wet wood shavings and you're mixing that with your food scraps, you might have the nitrogen to carbon ratio correct, but it's going to be too wet overall. And so by having a dry supply, or at least some of your carbon be drier, that helps offset and get that better moisture rate percent to support the buffet, to support the microbial life that's doing all the heavy lifting. Yeah, and so aeration. Kat, we're back to Kat to tell us more about aeration.
All right, thanks, Natasha. Yeah, so, you know, when we think about aeration, there's a few ways to think about it. One is how the pile is built. First of all the microbes need air, just like we all do. We can get air in the pile through structure, and that is through the different materials we're using. And then we can also get air into the pile through mechanization, through shovels, through aerated static pipes, so PVC pipes with holes poked in them, or coming in with a bucket loader if you're lucky enough to have a big machine to do all that work for you. So getting air into the pile is part of our job as composters. When we think about all of the different materials that we've seen in some of the slides past, I like to try and invite you to think about a wheelbarrow and think about adding into the wheelbarrow all of the recipe ingredients that you're using in the proportions that you think are right. And then just think about the amount of airspace that is in that wheelbarrow. That's the airspace is what we're looking for when we build a pile structure. So very often when I build a pile, the very bottom of the pile, like small scale farm or backyard, I'm building in a crisscross of corn stalks and sunflower stalks and things that are going to be able to have wet mass on top of them and still maintain some air. Some people like to get really techie and use the plastic pipes with holes poked in them because they're not going to crush no matter the mass. So it's a way to bring air in at the bottom of the pile, and then the heat inside of the pile is drawing that air up like convection. So the structure of your pile can make a really big difference, and that it doesn't matter if we're talking about a backyard system or all the way up to a large series of farm windrows. The way the pile is structured really matters. And then following that temperature to tell us when have the microbes used up all the air, then it's time for us to add air back into the pile. At school composting systems, we have kids do the work and it's great. They use shovels and wheelbarrows, and that brings air back into the pile, and then the temperature heats right back up again. And that'll continue happening every time you turn a pile. You should be able to put a thermometer in there and see the temperature rise again. If that temperature doesn't rise, either there's something else to troubleshoot, or perhaps your compost is finished. which you'll also have lots of other indicators like visual indicators showing you that your compost is finished. So adding air, do it from the structure built into the recipe. Use your thermometer to tell you when more air needs to be added to the pile, and then use some form of labor, whether it's your hands and a shovel or a bucket loader or a team of kids or aerated static pipe systems with air blowing into a pile to actually increase the airflow. And I think now we're turning it back over to Natasha, no, Athena. Oh no, I'm still talking about time. Right, so if you don't have enough time, if you don't have enough time, one way I like to do it is employ kids. That's really great. Lots of people can make it happen pretty quickly. In developing a system that works for you and your farm or your home or your system is what really matters. So when I'm building systems at schools, I know that I have a labor force of 9 and 10-year-olds that are going to do the work. So I can build a system based on that need. If I have a bucket loader, I can build a system sized to my bucket loader and then budget the time it takes to go and do that. If I don't have any of that equipment, I'm going to design my system in a way that I can build in enough structure in the pile itself using the ingredients so that I don't have to turn as much. And for those of you that are our farmers, we've already talked with you about how to structure your system to work with your time. And it takes time to develop that system and that relationship to your living organism compost pile to figure out what its needs are balanced with what your needs are. The good news is that composting is pretty forgiving. And even when you mess up a pile, you can start over with those same materials and correct it. So it's possible to balance time and labor, and we're hoping that you'll ask more questions about that so that we can try and help you figure out ideas to do that. Now I'm turning it over to Natasha. To Athena.
To Athena.
Thanks, Kat. Okay, so like any situation or problem that arises with your compost, it's really how well you manage your compost piles or system is how you'll be able to limit attracting wildlife or insects or any other creatures. So first, as we talked about earlier, you always want to cover your food scraps. So immediately in your collection cart, use wood shavings or sawdust to cover your food scraps, because that will prevent flies from laying their eggs onto the food scraps initially. And then when you put them in your pile, again, be sure to cover them immediately with your carbon sources to also prevent flies from laying their eggs onto the food scraps. That will help control an infestation of flies. So, and similarly with mosquitoes, if you have leachate coming out of your pile or in the ruts, if you've got a tractor that you're using or even a wheelbarrow, make sure you fill those ruts up so that there's not standing water, and limit any moisture coming off of your pile. By turning the pile and putting, make sure that the water is dispersed within your pile. And if you're having an issue with too much leachate coming off of your pile, flatten the pile so that the moisture goes into your pile and doesn't roll off of the pile or windrow. And there's other means that we can help you with if you are having a leachate issue, because that is, again, crucial for controlling the mosquito population. So wildlife, and including dogs, can be attracted to food scraps, obviously. So again, managing your piles so that your temperatures are up and so you have rapid decomposition is the best way to limit any odors, because that's what is going to attract food scraps, attract to your compost for any critters. So any rats or even birds are always going to smell the food scraps and your compost before even they're going to see it. So Eliminating those odors is how to control and limit any wildlife coming into your piles. And it is very toxic to wildlife, so it's very important that you do that. Putting an electric fence around bins is often a good thing, because bins are not likely to reach 131 temperatures rapidly enough to get your rapid decomposition, and not to stay that high. So if you have an issue with rodents or other wildlife getting into your bins, that may be one solution, is to put an electric fence around it. Obviously, that's not practical for windrows and big piles. And again, as you see, and for this bin here, and you can do this with all wood bins as well, put wire, a hard wire cloth around that. And we have bin design specifications that we can show you on those. So I think, oh, and I wanted to also address jumping worms in your compost. So that's a very bad issue, and we will address that further on, and maybe a compost tea talk. But make sure that you reach your temperatures, 131 and PFRP, throughout the process, and that kills off the jumping worm eggs. And even in the Jora, if that's a system you're going to be using, it's crucial that you make sure you monitor your temperatures and get those temperatures up. And then Natasha can tell you more about potentially solarizing your piles and or your bins, because that again kills off the worms and also their cocoons. And that's very, very important to do. And I think that is it on the attracting wildlife. Next.
Great, thank you. And we're going to move into Q&A in just a minute. So hopefully you've been jotting down any questions or thoughts you have as we've been running through these slides. And the last sort of topic that we're going to be troubleshooting, which does come up for a lot of groups, is I'm having trouble finding the right feedstock. So we've now told you how important it is to have nitrogen-rich materials and carbon-rich materials. And we've said a few times that diversity of different feedstocks or recipe ingredients is best. Where the heck do you get all this stuff, right? And some of you have CSAs, and you can get food scraps from, we seem to have, access to the nitrogen-rich pieces, but not always. Sometimes you may want to have a larger volume, and you need to think about how to get more food scraps or nitrogen-rich, maybe manures into your system. But carbon is often, we sort of refer to that, it's often the limiting factor. We often refer to it as like the governor of the system, right? So really, you can only compost as much food scraps as you have carbon to match, so that they actually are composting and breaking down in a way that's healthy for everybody. So we have this this worksheet that we've shared with our partners, and that is posted on the website, called Mapping Reciprocal Partnerships, or an asset mapping exercise. We always recommend that folks try to think as broadly as possible about where they might get stuff, and tell people what you're doing. What we found is that sometimes, you're just sort of doing your own thing, and people may not know what you're doing, but the more you talk about your project, why you're doing it, why it's important to you, the value that you see it adding to your community, all kinds of people, and sometimes the most unexpected people, have solutions for you, or have access to, wood shavings, or, may have a landscaping business, or, have some connection to a lumber yard or something like that, some access to resources that would fill in a need that you have in your recipe. You can post on neighborhood networks, on forums, or Facebook neighborhood groups or pages. And just really thinking the reciprocal part of it is also, we try to help people think about how to frame things in terms of also providing back to those who may be helping you out. So it might be, this is great, and at the end, once you have some finished compost, maybe you give like a thank you 5-gallon bucket of finished compost. Or it could be that you have a neighbor that has some livestock, and they don't really have, they're not composting or don't really know how to manage their manure and bedding well. It could be a really great reciprocal relationship of, we'll take that off your hands, because for us, it's not a waste. It's this awesome resource that we would love to have. And so whatever sort of frame you can think to put on it, that's the best way to identify and sort of expand your circle of resources that you have access to. And then we're gonna, I just need to throw up this USDA's non-discrimination statement and just let, just affirm and thank the US Department of Agriculture Rural Utilities Program for funding this project and our time to host these Compost Tea Talks. And I think the last slide is just our contact information, which is also on our website. And so Kat, you can maybe stop sharing now, and so you can see each other. I'm not going to turn my camera back on because that seems to be a limiting factor on my internet speed today. So I apologize for that. But you all are welcome to share your cameras if you would like, if you have that available to you. And we did have one question come in, and so I'm just going to read it out, and then we can also, you guys can be thinking about your questions, but we do have a few questions that came in with registration that we can touch on as well. And so Lauren says she's curious about the benefits of breaking down materials to speed the composting process and wondering what is the most practical and low labor way to do it. So is that like running a lawnmower over the materials, using a leaf shredder, or something else? And Kat, why don't we go to you first?
Yes, breaking down materials definitely helps in the process, and especially as you're talking about woody materials, having smaller wood chips or shavings. But there's also, of course, you don't want to have too many woody materials in your compost because they take longer to break down generally. I like to keep about 10% of my overall recipe in wood chips. Otherwise, you have to end up screening them out. But breaking them down, I know one of the things I'm excited to learn more about, and Athena, I think, is a real authority on the Jora composting systems, which some of our farmers, and I think, Lauren, you might be one of them, getting the Jora composting system, which is an in-vessel insulated compost system that works really well to do that first sort of breakdown process that then can be followed up in a bin system or a windrow pile. Likewise, I know that when I use, when I'm feeding my worms food scraps, the smaller I can make those materials, the quicker my worms are going to be able to break those down with the help of all of the microbes that work with the worms. So it's true for food scraps, and it's also true for feedstocks. And yes, lawnmowers are a good way to sort of break down grass or hay. If you have the time, there's a cool little trick you can do. It's not really farm scale, but you can use like a metal trash can and a weed whacker and your leaves, and you can sort of like mix it like a drink and you get nice shredded leaves. Those also running the leaves over with your lawnmower can help. When you break down the particle sizes, you increase the space that microbes can be. So the more pieces a leaf is in, the more actual surface area you're creating, and then the microbes have more places to be. So that's the reason why that works. It's also why blending materials can work so well. So I'll leave it there. I'll bet Athena and Natasha have things to add.
Yeah, Athena, go ahead.
Kat, you covered it well. Again, microbes have really dinky mouths. So the smaller you can make at least the food scraps and some of the woody materials, carbon sources is excellent. Mowing over them for a Jora, we recommend even chopping, if you've got a bucket and you can take one of those little blade things you use in your garden and put your food scraps in that and chop it all up, and just make sure most of the pieces are pretty small. You're always going to have orange peels and avocado pits. I know that avocados are super popular these days, so there's not a lot you can do about those, and you'll just have to compost them best you can and then put them in your bin, and they may or may not decompose. And then a variety of carbon sources, the best way to handle the carbon materials. Natasha.
Yeah, great, thank you. And I'll just add, and we can put up a picture of the sort of bucket chopping method that Athena just mentioned. But that's whatever way you do it. You know, I personally have, we don't have kids and we live in a private place where I'm not worried about people coming into my composting area. I have a hatchet that I leave in an old stump next to my compost system. And so the other thing to think about is, you know, like a whole Hubbard squash or pumpkin is going to take longer to break down than if you can chop it up. And so it's a really reasonable thing when we're thinking about community, you know, getting food scraps from your community, whether it's from your CSA members or, you know, wherever really, is to ask people, let them know, you know, hey, can you just cut that cabbage in quarters before you put it in your bin and bring it to me, and sort of spread that workload out. And often people may just not think about it. They may just not know that that's important. And so, you know, you still might get, you know, a whole squash coming through or something like that. But the more you can just let people know that that's helpful. I work with one group and the compost stewards are like militant about having everything be cut into like 1 inch or less. That's really not necessary. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. It'll certainly compost a lot faster, but you know, it doesn't really need to be that exact. And I certainly, personally, am not that exact in mine. I mean, I think a cabbage cut in quarters is probably fine. So hopefully that helps. And I will also say that if I know compostable packet, like cups or plates, are truly only fiber and not lined with microplastics, and often I know that if I'm the one in control of having them in my house, I will just like dump out a bag load of those and run over them with my lawnmower. And they make this great popping sound. I promised a couple people I'm going to try to get a video of that this summer. Because there are times where if you're having a cookout or a big family get together, it's just handier to use something like that. And that can be a great source of carbon. But again, a whole plate or certainly a stack of plates are not going to break down, and it's not going to be as accessible or mix as well with the nitrogen rich food scraps if they're all in a big clump. And so anything you can do to sort of fluff it up and cut it up is better.
And Natasha, if I might add, just we know you're all farmers, since you're obviously going to have leftover produce and other things coming off of your farm. And so if you can't get to it right away to compost it, put some carbon over it and set it aside. And then when you can mow over it or chop it up and then add it to your drawer or bin system, or if you have a windrow or a pile system, that's the way you can handle those things even whole and not worry so much about them.
Yeah, for sure. We have
I just want to close with it just to give folks the understanding that, you know, all you're doing by breaking down the materials is speeding up the process. So if you want it to go faster, break them down. If you don't have time for that, just know it's going to take longer to compost.
Perfect. Yeah, absolutely. And so we have a question about temperatures and variations of temperature. Dan asked, what is an acceptable variation in temperature throughout a pile? And I'll just add, or windrow. Do either of you want to take that first?
Well, I'll start by saying that in my home compost pile, I have a 20 to 30 degree variation, sometimes just from corner to corner in my pile. And I know that that means that I didn't blend my materials enough. So that's my troubleshooting. When I have inconsistencies in temperatures, I'm only concerned if they're not reaching 131, which is our PFRP for pathogen kill. If I'm not reaching those temperatures, then I know I need to go in and add more air and blend materials in order to get that. Sometimes it's just easier to turn the whole pile in order to do that.
Athena?
That's exactly right. So, and with the windrow, it's your temperatures will vary, but if your interior is cold, like under 40 or under 60 or 70 even, that's an indication that you're not getting that mix, just like Kat said. So you'll really want to make sure that before you add your materials to your windrow, or when you do it at one end of your windrow, Dan, that you really mix that material up at the end, get a homogeneous mix, and then start your windrow from that and do the same thing. If you need to turn, if you don't have your temperatures high enough, you'll need to turn it when it gets below 140 and try to make sure it's uniform.
Yeah, and I'm just going to fold in a question that we got from registration into this conversation because it was about that. Someone said that that even with a tumbler, their compost takes sometimes years to cook, it seems, and they've tried adding water and doing the right carbon to nitrogen ratio, but it just doesn't get hot. And part of why I wanted to highlight this and bring this back into the conversation is this is where that thing that Kat talked about at the very beginning comes into play: volume or mass. And so the person was who put this question into who's actually not here, but I still think it's a worthwhile question to answer. If you're at a community garden and it's much smaller scale, you may not have the mass, like the physical volume, to really get those temperatures up. Things will still compost, but you then do need to just be thinking about what you're putting in there, whether that's meat or bones, if you're not meeting those temperatures, or weedy plants that may have gone to seed. You want to leave those things out if you're not getting hot temperatures. And I will just say personally, I have gotten in one of those tiny backyard bins, was able to reach that 131, I think I got it up to 134. And I did it as an experiment to see if it could be done. And it took a ton of management. And so you can do it, but I was like babying that pile like every, once or even twice a day. And I just did it as this short-term experiment to see, like, okay, even with a small volume, can this be done? And it can be, but I would say it's not realistic to expect that because of the level really of management. The exception to that might be in the medium to large tumblers. Still, a small tumbler may not get, you may not have the mass to really get up to temp, but the Jora tumblers do a pretty good job of that. But part of that is with that tumbling action, every time you walk by and sort of just give it a spin, you're sort of remixing the materials, redistributing any moisture that's in there. And so it's just an easier management style to get that right condition to really support those microbes. Anything else either of you want to add to that?
Well, just to say, Dan, you're just starting your windrow out, and I don't know what volume you're at now, but Natasha's right. I mean, I don't think you have the volume yet to really worry about it, as long as your temperatures are rising at least above 100 or so. But once you get rocking and rolling with your CSA collection and adding more volume of leaves, if you do have that issue, that's when you should start worrying, but I wouldn't worry now.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to ask, it looks like Dan, you had something to say. Go ahead, and then I'll say something.
Oh, I was just going to say thanks.
Oh, great.
Good. I'm just realizing, so I don't have a ton of experience with the Jora. I'm really looking forward to learning from Athena, who has a lot of experience. And we've talked about recipe and volume, and generally it's a 3-to-1. You want 3 parts carbon to 1 parts food scraps as a general rule. But when it comes to some of these container systems, your recipe actually changes. And Athena, I wondered if you wanted to talk about that a little bit.
Well, and your recipe changes more depending on what carbon you use. And we suggest using wood shavings for the Jora, and even in some bins, just because it covers the food scraps. We're talking about food scrap composting now, and it takes up less volume. So the more food scraps you enter into your Jora and or your bin systems, you cover those with wood shavings to save that volume so you can get more food scraps in there. So that's why, and again, Natasha went over the carbon recipes and the carbon to nitrogen ratio of various carbon sources. And wood shavings are skyrocketing with the carbon. So you've got 500 to 1 with wood shavings. So that's why for a Jora, if you're using wood shavings, you only need like 2 to 1 usually for your carbon to nitrogen ratio in the Jora. But if you're adding in other carbon sources for your Jora, such as leaves, or even dry grass clippings or residues from your farm, more woody products, you would use more, maybe 2 to 3 volumes carbon to nitrogen ratio, and just test it out like any other recipe you're going to use.
Yeah, Paige, I see your hand raised.
Hi. Yeah, I just have a question, and I'm wondering, I'm hoping it's not like a silly question, but do certain types of food scraps carry a specific type of like microbe that would help correct an issue like faster than others? Like I'm wondering if like bread waste with like yeast would help correct odor more than like adding vegetables and food scraps. Does that make sense?
I think that would be amazing research. We know that a diversity of materials brings in a diversity of organisms, but we don't know yet really which organisms come with which materials, with some differences. We know that food scraps come with a lot of bacteria. Grasses might come in with a lot more protozoa, and first cut grasses especially. So I think we have a lot to learn there, and I love the question. I wonder if my colleagues have any good answers there.
I think the best thing, Paige, is a balance of your food scraps, because we do know that meat has different microorganisms that come with it, and that's why it's slower to decompose. And also it's this what meat is composed with. And then what I have found in school composting, because they are so heavy on starches and bread and pizza crust, that it is actually a little slower to compost because it's not got the higher nitrogen that you would have with vegetables. And so that's what the organisms like to eat more, because its nitrogen breaks down more readily, it's wetter, it's a lot easier for them to digest, and they get more energy out of that kind of substance as opposed to the bread. So I think a diversity of food scraps in my experiences has been the best.
Yeah,
and then
and I'll just
your carbon.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. Anytime you have like an overabundance of one thing, you're going to have to adjust your recipe to account for that. So like Athena was saying, and I see the same thing with schools, like if it's like a ton of pasta and bread and kind of drier food scraps, you really have to watch your moisture. Similarly, if you do a ton of canning of tomatoes and you put all that kind of slop in your compost, let me tell you, that is like a ton all at once potentially that you're inputting into that system, and you have to adjust for it. I am lucky enough to have a father-in-law who sends us citrus every winter as our Christmas present, and my compost always gets a little funky because it doesn't last so long. And so within 2 weeks, my husband and I eat like a ton of grapefruits and oranges, and I put all of those peels into the compost, and it self-corrects. Like compost, like Kat said, is a very forgiving system given a little bit of time and some nudging in the right direction. But you know, I've definitely noticed like my compost smells a little different, it looks a little different when I've just dumped, you know, 48 citrus peels into it within a short period of time. And that's not to say, you know, and that's what I have, and that's how I manage my food waste, and that's totally fine. But I know that, and I kind of look out for that. And so that's just something to keep in mind. But in terms of Paige, I love your question too, but you had asked sort of about controlling odors. Really what I have found, and there's a ton we don't know, but like you need to get dry carbon on a pile if you're having an odor issue and you're trying to control that. And really, to some extent, it may be more if it's leaves and a little less if it's wood shavings, but you need to get carbon into that system. And that's sort of like the troubleshooting end game, is if something is happening with your system and it is funky and you don't know what to do, bury it in carbon. It's kind of like putting the brakes on. Everything's kind of slow down. It might cool off and get slower, and just like kind of like hit the pause button and get in touch with one of us for some troubleshooting help or a site visit, depending on what's going on. That seems extreme, but you know, especially I have to say, working with some school systems, I have seen some pretty extreme things where really you want to just bury it in carbon and remix and kind of like reset, regroup. I don't think any of you are going to get to that point, but just so you know, like even if you really go off the deep end in that extreme, you can recover from it, and we can help you figure out what to add in and you know, how to move on from wherever you've gone. And so there are no silly questions, and there is definitely no huge catastrophic mistakes in composting. It's all just learning and observing and figuring out what next steps to take to move your process forward.